Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We're excited to be with you again today for our next installment in our Next Economy Live series. I'm Isaac Graves. I'm with Social Venture Circle. And today we have a special guest, Natalie Nixon, who's a creativity strategist and president of Figure Eight Thinking, who's going to lead us through a really exciting session today. I just want to very quickly mention our wonderful partners who help make this series possible: the American Sustainable Business Council, Opportunity Collaboration, and Intentional Media. And just as a reminder, we will be recording the session. We're going to share it out afterwards, and we'll make sure we get you follow-up slides so you can sit back and be present and enjoy it, and you'll still have something to reference after the fact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Hi, everyone. Really good to be here with you. I hope that you've had a great, what is today? Today's Thursday. So I hope you've had a great Thursday. I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm really excited to share some ideas with you that I hope you'll find useful and super relevant given the circumstances that all of us collectively are finding ourselves in the context of COVID-19. So our discussion is based around this idea of cultivating foresight. And if you could, would you make sure you have available to you a piece of blank paper and a pen? Kind of a Sharpie pen is great, but blank piece of paper and a marker of some kind would be awesome. And I'm going to remind you about that again. As Isaac said, I'm a creativity strategist and I'm president of Figure Eight Thinking. I'm a hybrid. I have a background in anthropology and fashion, and after working in the fashion industry and as an entrepreneurial hat designer and in global sourcing, living and working in Sri Lanka and in Portugal and traveling throughout Asia, I entered academia and I was a professor at Philadelphia University for 16 years. And my last contribution to academia was I founded a strategic design MBA program. So I always like to say that my grounding in anthropology, cultural anthropology, equipped me to ask questions from what I call the worm's eye view, right? Which is very different from the training you get if you study sociology or poli-sci or economics. My background and training in fashion gave me a deep appreciation for the role of logistics and supply chain management and technology in business, as well as the value of aesthetics and desire and beauty and foresight in trying to understand consumer insights. So I am at a really magical place in my career where I'm able to integrate all of that. And so I just say that for some context about why this topic of foresight is of particular interest to me. And I hope that you'll walk away from our 45 minutes or so together also intrigued. This is a photograph that was part of an article that came out in the Harvard Business Review back on March 23rd. And some of you may have caught this article, may have read it. It's called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And I really loved the article, despite the sad characteristic of the title, because it was just a super interesting conversation about where our minds and emotions go when all around us there's a lot of constraints in terms of our space, in terms of how we use our time, in terms of our financial resources, obviously. And the article was written by Scott Barinato, who is an editor at Harvard Business Review. And he interviewed David Kessler, and David Kessler is a world-renowned grief expert. So it was just a Q&A, but it was super informative. And there's two takeaways that I want to share with you. The first takeaway from the article is this idea that David Kessler shared about something called anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief. And he explained that when anticipatory grief goes left, when it doesn't turn out so well, we get full of anxiety. And that's when our minds go to a state of worry, complete stressing out about all the horrible future scenarios that could happen based on, in today's case, COVID-19. The other way that anticipatory grief another response to anticipatory grief. So one response is anxiety, right? Maybe my hand should go down. The other response on the upward direction is that we, as a result of feeling that anticipatory grief, can trigger ourselves to be completely present and to have a sense of, and force ourselves to have a sense of well-being and really focusing on what is. And that, of course, takes practice. But this idea of anticipation, of course, is something that is what we have to do when we're practicing foresight, which we'll discuss in a little bit. The second takeaway from this article is that most of us are aware that there are 5 stages of grief. And the last stage of, so parts of it are, denial and disbelief and anger. The 5th traditional stage of grief is acceptance. This has happened. This horrible situation has happened. And what David Kessler also talked about is that he said I would add a 6th stage of grief. And I would call this 6th stage of grief, that's super important, meaning. The ability to, after you go through the sadness, the grief, the denial, the anger, the acceptance, to then figure out the meaning behind all this. In my work as a creativity strategist, in my view, creativity is a critical competency to help us derive meaning out of sometimes ambiguous situations. So I just wanted to kind of start there to kind of set the tone and kind of bring us all to where in reality we are, but with some really cool directives from experts like David Kessler. So we'll share the link to that HBR article. If you would, if there are moments during this presentation where you hear something of interest, I would love it if you would share out on your social media channel of choice. Use the hashtag #CreativityLeap. And my handle on Instagram and on Twitter is NatW_Nixon. So I hope that we'll start seeing each other more and through those channels, and you'll choose to follow me on my various social media channels. I would love to be in touch with you. So if you haven't yet already, just a reminder, please make sure you have a blank piece of paper and a pen. And if you would now, if you can grab a blank piece of paper and a pen, would you take your paper and would you fold it into quarters? So just fold it in half once, and then fold it in half one more time, because we're going to do some reflection and a little interaction, and Isaac is going to help me with that a little later. So when you unfold it, you're going to have 4 virtual sections on your piece of paper. Feel free to draw axes lines, y-axis and x-axis through your piece of paper. I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I'm actually going to time your minute with my smartphone, my iPhone, and I'm going to give you 60 seconds. I would like you to think about a challenge that you have, and I want you to frame that challenge as a title, as a caption, and just write it on the top part of your piece of paper. You can think of that challenge on a functional level, or on a social level, or an emotional level. We will be asking people to share later, so it's up to you how personal you want to be. We welcome all ranges of sharing. So I'll just leave with an example. One of the challenges that I have right now is encouraging people to be their most creative in a time that's full of anxiety and a perception of scarcity. And my goal in my work is to equip people to understand what creativity actually is and really embrace it. Creativity might seem like a luxury to some people if you're focused on being uber practical. So my challenge would be, how do I help people amplify creativity? And if you want to frame it as a question, that's more awesome than even as a title. So 60 seconds starting right now. You have about 25 seconds left. Okay, you have 10 seconds. Okay, Sharpies down. Awesome. Okay, so we're going to get back to that in a little later. Thank you for doing that. So, one of the things I just want to start by saying is what foresight is not. So, foresight is not predicting the future. It's not about having these big declarations about X will happen in a certain amount of months or years. So it absolutely is not a predictive way of acting or being. That's, excuse me, that's absolutely not what foresight is. Foresight instead is really a way of anticipating change that is hyper present, which may seem a bit of an oxymoron when you think about, well, you say the word foresight, you think, well, that has to be about, you know, if you're talking about anticipating what's coming next, you've got to be trying to be predictive. Actually, no. The best way to practice foresight is to be hyper present about what is in our present state, and then using those observations to identify and anticipate multiple possible future scenarios, right? It's really about laying the table for possible options of how things may play out so that you can prepare yourself, your team, your organization on a functional level, a social level, and on an emotional level. So that's what foresight is. Foresight is our ability to anticipate needs that will come by being hyper present and mapping out multiple possible future scenarios. So I want to share a story that some of you may be familiar with. Oh, okay. I thank you, Isaac. I was just saying the screens, but I was doing that for dramatic effect, just to show that foresight is not looking into a crystal ball. But I want to share a story related to the company Coca-Cola. So a couple of decades ago, when a little grocery store called Whole Foods was on the up and up, was on the rise, Coca-Cola kind of dismissed it as this, you know, bougie, healthier than thou, organic type of market that probably wouldn't have much traction. I mean, after all, you go in there, you buy 4 items and you've spent $30, you know. How could that possibly scale? How could something so niche like making local organic food and healthy meal options more accessible to people, albeit at a higher price, but how could that ever take off? Well, fast forward to the past couple of years, and as we know, Whole Foods has been acquired by Amazon. Now, set aside your opinions about Whole Foods, Amazon, Coca-Cola. As an example, as a model, I tell it because now Coca-Cola cannot get into one Whole Foods door, right? They are not prepared, they're not positioned. Let's set aside their Dasani water option. They can't get into a Whole Foods door to sell their products because of a condition, which is sometimes called too big to fail. And I also like to call it a superiority complex. There are 2 barriers to having foresight. There's many, but I'm going to highlight 2 right now. One is a superiority complex, where when you look in your rearview mirror, you see no one. So you just kind of have this, like, you can just coast along, things are just great, things will be easy peasy. The other condition that can set us up to fail is when we have an inferiority complex. When we have false assumptions that we're so small, no one could possibly be interested in our offering. And both mean that we aren't able to anticipate the possible multiple directions that a situation could go. So I want you to just remember that story no matter what size or scale the organization that you lead or that you're working for is, be sure that you help your colleagues be conscientious of not falling into either superiority complex or an inferiority complex and really miss huge opportunities, because Amazon is, of course, the largest retailer in the world currently. Amazon also has to be careful not to fall into a superiority complex. So a lot of what Foresight is going to require of us is to really hone into perspective. So this is a beautiful Ansel Adams-like photograph of a natural landscape. And based on this side of this lake, there's certain things that we can see about the clouds that are coming in. We kind of understand higher peaks, miles away from us. We see a density of a forest. We see maybe an enclave of boats. It looks like a pier across the lake. That's one perspective that we can have. Another perspective may look something more like this. And so the other thing that it's really important to do in the practice of foresight is zooming in and zooming out. And it's a constant ease to be able to do both, to not be so myopic on something, but also to not stay in the clouds or only in the area where you are. Walk around a little bit. One of the things I like to remind organizations is, especially when they're building new strategies, to get out the building. Don't keep relying only on your surveys or on your focus groups. You've got to get out of the building and talk to real people, because there's a big gap analysis between what people say and what people do. So a lot of this falls into this work of what I call paying attention to signals on the landscape. So here's a couple of examples of signals on the landscape that I've been collecting in my work as a creativity strategist. So example number one, the World Economic Forum back in 2016 had declared that by the year 2020, creativity would rank as the number 10 job skill. They had just said that the year earlier, that in 4 years' time, creativity is going to be a number 10 job skill in the world. And fast forward to, sorry, excuse me, I said that incorrectly. Let me start over. Back in 2015, the World Economic Forum had declared that creativity would be the number 10 job skill by 2020. 1 year later, they said, actually, we're thinking that creativity is going to be the number 3 job skill in the world by 2020. Now, what's interesting to me is that the job skills number 1 and number 2 include things like problem solving and critical thinking. So in fact, that's still creativity, right? Problem solving, critical thinking are all bundled into the competencies for creativity. But when a global, world-renowned organization like the World Economic Forum makes these sorts of declarations, it's something to pay attention to. Another signal on the landscape that I thought is super interesting in terms of the role of creativity in people's lives. I watch TV, and I think we have to admit that TV's never been better. And one of the shows my family, that we, especially when our daughter was in high school, really enjoyed watching was Blackish. And this is an image of one of the children in the family on the sitcom Blackish. This character's name is Junior. And we're seeing Junior in a moment where he is making a declaration to his parents that even though he's gotten into college, he has no intention of going. He's decided he wants to, he needs to take a gap year. So that was interesting. About 6 months later, I'm watching the television show Big Little Lies. And this is a character named Abigail. She's the daughter of Madeline. Madeline, if any of you watch the show, may recall that Madeline was played by Reese Witherspoon. And Abigail is a handful, and she's a senior in high school. And this is Abigail saying to her mother very adamantly, she's not even going to apply to college. She's already gotten a job at a startup. Now, something I think is hilarious about these two examples. Number one, the stance of both of these teenagers is pretty identical. But number two, what we're seeing reflected back to us in these pop culture moments are as shift in the Gen Z and the Centennial generation, where they are really questioning the ROI of higher education. They're questioning the debt that they will incur. They're questioning the way that they're learning. They want to learn hands-on. They want to learn experientially. They want to learn by doing, which for me in my work was a keen observation for me to record, because it speaks to that experiential way of learning and working that creativity lends itself to. And I've been predicting for a while that we probably are going to go back to seeing ourselves go back to an apprenticeship model of some sort. The last pop culture signal in the landscape that I'll point out as it relates to creativity and the role of creativity in our work lives is this character. So this is an image of the character Wendy Rhodes from the hit show Billions. I don't know if any of you watch Billions. I love Billions. Billions takes place in New York City in our present time, and it's the story of a power struggle between a district attorney and the head of Axe Capital, a venture capital firm, a VC firm, where the folks who work for Axe Capital wake up every day only to make money, and they're really hard driven. What's fascinating to me in this show, which is now about 5 years old, is that the character Wendy Rhodes is a PhD psychologist who sits in the C-suite. And her role for this team is to help them be attuned to their inner child, is to help them to do much better visualization work and to practice mindfulness. So this was significant to me because of all of the talk that we were seeing dismissed in the early 2000s, which more and more was becoming taken more seriously, that of soft skills like collaboration, like empathy, deep listening, the ability to work well in a team, to have curiosity, all the elements of creativity. So this is what I mean by signals on the landscape of being paying hyper attention to the present. So in traditional ways and modes of problem solving and building strategy, if any of you went to a more traditional business school program and earned an MBA, you might be familiar with this sort of process of problem solving, this is also known as the GAFI model of problem solving, GAFI. It's an acronym for these very nice, neat, linear phases of problem solving where you gather information, maybe through survey data and that sort of thing. You analyze the information, you formulate a solution, and then voila, you implement the solution into the marketplace. Well, the challenge is that works fine, maybe in a textbook, maybe in a really confined environment, but when you're talking about trying to survive in what are called VUCA environments that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, that way of working goes out the window. It's totally impossible to just gather information, analyze it, formulate, and voila, implement. I mean, how well has that served us in the time of COVID, right? We haven't been able to seamlessly and efficiently gather information. We haven't been able to work across multiple stakeholders to analyze and give back data in a timely way. We haven't been able to formulate in an expedient way a policy and then implement solutions, because this COVID-19 environment is a great example of a VUCA environment. So when you're talking about having to survive in VUCA environments, you need different tools. And so Foresight offers some tools, and I'm going to share one framework with you today that is used by Foresight practitioners. And this, by the way, is one of the tools that I learned when I went through a certification process at the Institute for the Future. So I'm actually certified as a Foresight practitioner, which is kind of cool. So if you have another piece of paper, maybe even jot down some notes, although I will be sharing my deck of slides with everyone who's registered later. But here are the 4 archetypes of future scenarios. Archetype number 1 is a growth archetype. And in the growth archetype, you know, that's a scenario where, you know, we have constant growth. And by the way, that's a scenario that drives Wall Street, right? That's a scenario that has meant that triple bottom line, people, profit, planet, people have been more resistant to it, except of course, when Larry Fink wrote his letter in January of this year to CEOs. It's an annual letter that he writes. And this time in his letter, he said that his company, BlackRock, which holds over $7 trillion of assets under management, said that they would begin to use sustainability as one of the variables, the constraints that they use to make investment decisions. And when Larry Fink speaks, people listen. But one of the challenges with this constant growth archetype of a future scenario is that it doesn't necessarily prepare you for something like the economic calamity of 2008 and the health pandemic of COVID-19. A second archetype and this future scenario model is the archetype of constraints. And in this archetype of constraints, things are going along fine, and then we hit a wall, right? We hit a wall in terms of being pulled between resources. And the constraints, think about having to now be smushed or toggling between resources around time, around money, around people talent, right? So things are going along fine and they just kind of plateau, right? So what do you do in that future scenario? What's the best way to prepare in that case? A third archetype in these future scenarios is that of collapse, right? So things are inching along just fine. We have this growth mode and all of a sudden, psh, which is what happened clearly in the Great Depression of 1929, which had cascading effects around the world. And then a fourth archetype is that of transformation. Now, one of the reasons why this line is a little wobbly is because just of the tools I had available to make these slides, but also I think it turned out pretty great because transformation is a wobbly, shaky, rough draft, sketchy process. It's not neat and pretty and clean. Transformation, you get dirty, you get bruised a lot. You got to return back to things and revisit things quite a bit. You have to be super nimble and prepared to stretch yourself in order to get to that growth state. So to make this hopefully even clearer, I'm going to share some examples of questions that could be posed in each of these archetype scenarios. And if you would, it would be really helpful for the exercise we're going to do, even though you're going to get a copy of these slides, if you would just jot down these examples, because I suspect some of you are going to forget these and you'll need these as kind of reminders when you frame your own questions as relates to the challenge that you articulated at the beginning of our time together. So let's start with the growth quadrant. An example of a question that might be proposed when we're exploring growth in a particular area is a question like this: what's the opportunity for future economic growth? And that's a question that a lot of us are asking right now, that a lot of business leaders, government leaders, community leaders, families are asking, what's our opportunity for future economic growth? What's the likelihood that things can continue to progress in an upward level? So that's an example of how you might frame a question in that way. The constraint quadrant. One way you might frame a question to think about constraints would be, how are we going to balance individual freedom on the one hand and collective safety on the other? So you see what I just did, where I outlined, I named within that question two ends of a spectrum. And this question actually is something that our country was dealing with at the beginning of COVID-19, right? There were people who didn't take it too seriously. They're like, I'm an American, I have my individual freedom, my individual rights, privacy, right? How do we balance out those two constraints, those two needs, and what might the effects be if we do? What might be the effects if we don't? A third question, I think this is super interesting, if we go over to the collapse quadrant. Here's an example of how collapse is not necessarily negative, right? So if you ask the question, what's the collapse of Cancer? Wow, I mean, mind blown. That gets us thinking about all sorts of amazing future scenarios and opportunities if we can destroy Cancer, if no one ever has to suffer through that disease again. Another way of framing a question in the collapse quadrant is, what's the collapse of war? Which again is positive, right? What could happen if we could end war and just build global compassion? What might happen with that? And then finally, a type of question you might frame if you're talking about transformation is, how might technology amplify versus obliterate creativity? And that's a question that I think about a lot, because we are currently, everyone, in what people are calling the fourth industrial revolution, right? This fourth industrial revolution where technology is ubiquitous. I have, and I don't want to say too loud, an Alexa in my office. I have, which is a form of augmented reality. Google uses AI, artificial intelligence, analytics is robotics. They're using our healthcare systems. So there is kind of a dystopian future that we could build up where, gosh, you know, technology is going to take over and where's the human left, right? On the other hand, might there be a scenario where technology actually amplifies what it means to be human and can amplify creativity? So for example, I watched the Super Bowl this year, and one of the commercials, which I just loved, was a commercial that Google did. Some of you may know about this commercial where there's an older gentleman who clearly has lost his wife, or maybe his wife is very ill. And he's saying to the Alexa equivalent in this Google ad, remind me of how she liked to take walks after it rained. Remind me of her favorite joke. Remind me of the song we danced to at our wedding, et cetera, right? So that was, to me, it just brought tears to my eyes, and it was a beautiful example of how technology can amplify what it means to be uniquely human. Okay, I hope you've jotted down some of these examples, because now it's your turn. Now I would like you to pose new questions for your challenge. Now here's why I'm not asking you to pose solutions in these future quadrants. I don't want you to jump to solutions. One of the challenges I'll go back to the Gaffey model of thinking and working, is that it's solutions oriented. You get rewarded for your solutions. Well, if you're in this VUCA environment, the solution is not always immediately clear, and there might be multiple solutions depending on the situation. You've got to be a lot more agile in your thinking. So what we'd like you to do is go back to that piece of paper where you've written out your caption. What is your challenge, your question? You have 4 quadrants you can draw lines through. And I'm only going to give you, 90 seconds, which I know sounds obnoxious. How dare I just give you 90 seconds? But here's why. Time is an amazing constraint for creativity. If I gave you 5 minutes to work on this, you go on and on and on. 90 seconds. And here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to dream up questions using the template that I just showed you for at least one of these 3 quadrants. I'm restricting you and telling you you cannot pose a question in the growth quadrant. The reason is because all of us want to imagine a future scenario of growth, but life happens, and it's highly likely that it may not just go in the direction of growth. Well, what are some questions that you could pose that get you starting to think about possible scenarios based on a constraint scenario as it relates to your challenge, or a collapse scenario as it relates to your challenge, or a transformation scenario? So I'm going to pause for a moment and just ask if any of you are unclear about what I'm asking you to do. We're not going to start yet. I just want to see if there are any clarifying questions. And Isaac, let me know if anyone is typing any clarifying questions in the chat. If you're clear, if you could just write the word clear or all clear in the chat room, that lets us know we can move on.
Looks like we're clear.
All right, awesome. Cool. Thank you,
wait, sorry, there's a question. Can you define collapse again?
Yes. So the collapse archetype is when excuse my French, but the negative way shit hits the fan, right? The example I gave was the Great Depression of 1929. But what I posed were some questions where you can see that a collapse future scenario can actually have a positive outcome. It's all about, once again, perspective.
And there's another quick question. Do we use the same format for each quadrant question as you did?
No, you don't have to. Please don't. Please do not stay confined to the way I did. No, 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 no. There's so many ways you could frame the question. I was just trying to be helpful and give examples. Great question.
And that appears to be all we have.
Awesome. Okay, so I'll repeat the instructions. I'm going to give you 90 seconds. I want you to try to fill out 2 of the 3, you can't use growth, 2 of the 3 quadrants with questions framed in the way you would need to ask a question for that particular archetype, scenario archetype. And then we're going to have a little conversation. People, I hope, will be willing to share the question they formed and what types of future scenarios it gets them to start thinking about. So starting, I have my timer up. I'm going to time it to 1 minute and 30 seconds. If you can get at least 1 question framed, bravo. If you can get 2, awesome. You do not need to do 3. Okay, starting right now. "50 seconds left, 50. "30 seconds left. All righty, that's my timer. So please pause. I'm going to go out of my shared screen. And Isaac, would you explain how we want people to share?
So if folks want, there's the raise hand function that you can press if you would like to share in response to one of Natalie's questions. If you prefer to leave it in the chat box, I can read those out loud. And just raise your hand as prompted, and I will enable you to talk and unmute your microphone. Just please be succinct in any response that you give, knowing that we've got so many people on the call. Okay, we have a hand raised from Roman.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Hi.
So very quickly, I guess my overarching issue was very functional. It was about hammering down an internal strategy for my organization. And then in terms of constraint, my question was, I kind of did it how you did it, where I had 2 scenarios or 2 extremes, where I said how to balance capacity restrictions with the strategic needs. And then for collapse, I put down, what if executing this framework ends up being too hard? And then for transformation, I put down how will we reassess or revisit this as we try to implement.
Wow, look at you. You got to all 3. That's awesome. I love your what if question. I love questions that start with what if. And knowing your organization, which one would you be interested in having them tackle through as a prompt to think through possible scenarios? Which of those 3 questions that you constructed so well?
I would probably say the transformation one. Yeah.
Because?
Because I feel like there is a temptation to think of this as a one-time thing and then it's supposed to work perfectly. And I would like to sort of like just kind of like manage expectations and think of like, okay, this is going to take some feedback loops.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was great.
You. Next we have Jan. You can unmute your mic, Jan.
Okay.
There you
Hi.
are.
Hi. How you doing? This is really great. So my question or my topic was dividing my time among family, friends, business, philanthropy. And so on the constraint level, I wrote basically the same thing. How am I going to hold my business obligations and my philanthropy and my cash calls and all those things at the same time as my adult children and so many other people are in need. So it's this time and money thing that you mentioned earlier. Second, collapse. I've got a terrible collapse, 2 terrible collapses. Well, one great. What if my son dies in New York when I'm not there? He's sick right now. My 31-year-old son.
He is sick?
Yeah. And I left New York.
Sorry.
Yeah, we'll see how he's doing. And I have my other sons are in Costa Rica and in Argentina, and I'm in Idaho now, out of New York. Anyway, what? I don't even want to think about that one. And the collapse of life as we know it, because we're never going to go back. And so all those wonderful opportunities, sense of place, friendships, what's important. How am I, what am I going to do to change my life now?
Wow. That takes a lot of courage to face those questions, a lot of courage. And I appreciate you sharing something so personal. And because you did, I just want to emphasize again, in my work, we have gotten to a place in our educational system, in a lot of our organizational cultures, where we have penalized curiosity, right? Where people become really afraid to ask a question. They don't want to sound stupid, right? Clearly, curiosity is the product of an information gap, right? There's a brilliant man named Ian Leslie who wrote a book called Curious, and that's what he writes about in that book. But Warren Berger, who wrote another great book called A More Beautiful Question, has written about how asking questions is a way of thinking. So when we dampen that, when we stop it up, when we hinder people from doing that, we're actually preventing ourselves from thinking in a much more expansive way. So I appreciate you sharing what is a really painful scenario to have to think through. I thought your first question, and I guess that was in the upper right quadrant.
Yes.
The constraint one was cool because I can now bring in, as you think about, okay, now what, after you frame these questions, the other thing that you can start doing, you were already bringing in stakeholders, right? So you frame these questions, in the example of the constraint quadrant, you have identified constraints, and then you can plug in various stakeholders into each of these areas to understand what might be the ramifications, what might be the reactions, actually go out and then interview people. I mean, there's a lot of really cool ways you can then extend this model. So thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you.
And next we have Karen.
Hi, Karen.
You are muted. Karen Ribeiro, if you can unmute.
Oh, sorry.
There you are. Hi.
Oh, wow. So I was giving a shout out to my friend Jan. It was so great to see her face on this screen. Anyway, I love quadrants, so I loved this exercise, and I also did a number of questions related to my challenge. The first one in growth was, where can I plug into existing networks? The goal is to continue growing my network with creative ideas and energies. So like specific where to plug in. Constraint, I feel is a little bit more, is doable for me because I can kind of see it, but I put how to grow organically, slowly enough to not be overwhelmed, but satisfying enough to keep myself engaged.
So what are that was constraint?
What the question is for constraint?
Yes, thank you. And what were the kind of the two ends of the spectrum?
Oh, so to grow organically, slowly enough to not be overwhelmed, but satisfyingly enough to keep myself engaged.
Okay, so engagement and anxiety maybe, or the kind of the two constraints. Okay, just trying to think that through. Thank you. Did you have another?
Yeah, collapse is really specific. It's like, how can the gift economy support my work to evolve beyond ownership struggles of capitalism? And the transformation, I feel, is the one that I really want to dig into more, which I wrote, who and where will I be when success feels real?
Oh, I love that question. That's a great envisioning question.
Thanks.
Now, when we have such optimistic questions like that, it's important we go for all the daisies in the field, but all of us know every growth chapter in our lives has been a product of also going through a lot of growing pains. So it's always important to keep in mind that we need to try to anticipate what the prickly points will be and what the pain points will be. I just want to call out that in the chat room, Chuck Brown, I love this question that Chuck Brown framed, how he reframed collapse. He posed, what does the collapse of wealth hoarding look like? I love that. And his constraint question is, how will we balance the need to take care of ourselves versus giving and investing generously in others, right? So self, others in that constraint model. That's awesome. And let's take one more person, please.
Okay, we have Terry.
Hi, Terry.
Okay, give that 1 second. Terry, if you can unmute your mic. There you are.
Is that good?
That's good.
Okay, great. So my question is regarding a business that a business partner and I are picking up that's been established making green building products. And so I had 3 quadrants. What if government funding dries up? And so does housing and building. And then what if there is economic collapse and social distancing remains so that there is no construction allowed? And then the part that I was very excited about was the transformation. So I had 2 there. What if new partnerships are created that minimize dependency on one sector and can combine? And then what if we could actually, if the COVID-19 crisis forces us to have to build housing for the homeless?
Yep, 3D digital printed housing, baby. It's possible. It's possible right now for us to print affordable, dignified housing that we can have in disaster situations, that we can have among the urban poor. What I think is interesting, Terry, and you went there later, but in your collapse question, your collapse question that you framed, you got to strategic partnerships in your transformation scenario. But if government funding does dry up, then one of the things to start thinking about right now are what are some other alternative strategic partners we could be thinking about reaching out to and start working with that could provide other revenue streams. And then we kind of got to it in this last couple of minutes also when you're talking about what if, because of social distancing, housing construction dries up, maybe it means that it's just a different type of housing, right?
Right.
Needed, yeah? So that's the beauty of questions, right? Like, I know all of our teachers always said, there's no such thing as a stupid question, but there really isn't. And it totally leads to more insights, more questions, different people to talk to. I also just want to point out how beautiful you guys are on this call, because after Janet Morgan shared the worry that she has for her son who's ill right now. So many people posted that they're thinking about her. Someone posted an alternative medicine doctor in New York City. So I think that's really awesome. So thank you everybody for doing that. So we're gonna come to a close and I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen, which is here. No, which is here. Okay. All right. So thanks so much for suspending judgment and playing around with this. And really, you should think about moving forward, playing with this this framework. I'd like to invite you, if you want. I'm coming out with a new book. My first book is a book I edited called Strategic Design Thinking. And my next book comes out this June 23rd to be exact. It's called The Creativity Leap: Unleash Curiosity, Improvisation, and Intuition at Work. And I'd love to share a sample chapter of my book with anyone who wants to stay in touch with me. Just text the word create to the number 33777. So 33777 is basically the telephone number, and in the body of the text create. If you are calling from Canada or any other international country, feel free to just email me if you're interested, and email me at Natalie@figure8thinking, that's FIGURE, the number 8 thinking.com. It'd be great to hear from you. Okay, so we do want to see, are there any other kind of, maybe we can have time to take 2 questions. Anyone have 2 questions and maybe just plop them into the chat, or if Isaac, if you want to unmute people.
Yeah, if you want to raise your hand, I can call on you, or if you'd prefer to put it in the chat, please do put it there. All right, I've got one that came through the Q&A box, which is, so when you're, what's a good place to start, rephrasing it? What's a good place to start to practice foresight?
So one place to start is to gather together a group of willing allies in your work environment and kind of form a independent team that will be willing to work on, noodle on a challenge that maybe one of the challenges you've identified now, and then be willing to share out. So don't remain in secret, but share out your insights, share out the new questions that are coming, and try to start prototyping some of these future scenarios. A prototype could be a role play, a prototype could be a visual mock-up, a rendering. Start doing some interviews with different stakeholders and people. That's one way. If you want more formal training on foresight, as I mentioned, I went to, I think it was a 3-day, what I thought it was a lot of fun, intensive training to get certified in strategic foresight at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California. And there are many other futurist and foresight organizations that you could look into. That's just the one I happen to get my grounding in. Again, coming from the world of fashion, I certainly was much more grounded in trends research. My friend and colleague Valerie Jacobs likes to say that trends are data from the future. I love that. I'll say that one more time. Trends are data from the future. I love that expression, and it really is true. And again, it requires intense observation of our present time. Are there any other questions?
It looks like with that, I want to just pose, Natalie, is there anything else that you want to share with our audience before we wrap things up?
Sure. I just want to thank you again for spending some time with us today. I will share my slide deck with you. I'm happy to share a sample chapter from my new book. You see on the screen a card game that I made up. It's called the Wonder Rigger Discovery Deck. It's called that because the way I define creativity in the Creativity Leap is that creativity is our ability to toggle between wonder and rigor to solve problems. So this is a card game that a lot of my clients find super helpful to help in when their teams are going through a particular challenge, to identify ways to build in more wonder or more rigor. And wonder is audacity, big blue sky questions, pausing, awe. Rigor is time on task, discipline, incessant practice, and both are needed in the practice of creativity. So would love it if you want to check out that card game. Would love it if you buy an advanced copy of the Creativity Leap, and would definitely love it if you email me. Stay in touch.
All right. And on behalf of Social Venture Circle, I just want to thank you so much, Natalie. And thank you all for joining us. This is a part of our Next Economy Live series. We host different engaging talks Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern every day, every week, not every day yet. And hope you can join us again. And again, we will follow up with the recording, the deck, and information that Natalie has brought up on today's call so that you can stay engaged. Have a great one, everyone.
Thank you.